Because God gave Adam the task of working, right? He says, well, now you have to work in pain and thorns, etc. So he sets it out. So the work is going to be painful, which is actually the antidote to this lack of maturity that you see among men. Which God not only gave us the punishment for having to work, but He also gave us the natural inclination to find fulfillment in that work.
Hey everyone, thanks for joining us in another episode of The Catholic Gentleman. I am uniquely blessed and excited to bring to you this guest expert here, Father Chad Ripperger, to discuss the lives of men today, and in particular, this great new book that he came out called Shop Talk. So a shout out to today's show sponsor, which is Exodus 90. I'm going to talk more about them later. Today, we find boys moving to this state of adolescence and, frankly, never getting out of it. Not only is this state of existence contrary to right order, it stunts growth and keeps boys mentally, emotionally, spiritually, and physically trapped in immaturity. Today, Father Ripperger and I discuss how the world has changed from his youth and time working in his father's diesel mechanics shop to today's failure to launch generation. In his newest book, Shop Talk, we hear in his own words how his upbringing formed him into a Catholic man and what we can learn to be better husbands, fathers, and strong men. If you like what we're doing, please head over to Catholic Gentleman Plus, consider donating, consider joining us over there where we're coming out every single month with new material for men designed to help you in your pathway to holiness, in your pathway and growth in virtue and excellence, and ultimately to become a saint. So please like and subscribe to our show. Again, we're so grateful for all that you can do, spreading it out to your friends. Now on to our conversation with Father Ripperger. He needs no introduction. Our listeners are so familiar with him. They've asked for you, Father, to be on the show many times. And so thank you, our listeners, for your prayer. And Father, how are you doing today?
Pretty good. Thank you for having me.
Wonderful. So what's keeping you busy this summer?
Well, right now I'm actually preaching a set of retreats. Right next week, I'll be doing one for young men. In fact,
excellent.
And it's actually somewhat on the topic of how do you become a true young man. Ultimately, is part of it. But so I'm doing a little bit of that. But then also I have my normal sessions for exorcisms and all that. So it's kind of a typical summer.
Great. Is the retreats for lay individuals?
Yes.
And is there a way that other people can find out about them?
Yeah, if they go to Montecristo, LLC.net, we post, I think if I remember right, he posts them when the availability in February, and then we have them every June.
Yeah, excellent. I will put that in the show notes. I really appreciate you. You'll be in our prayers as you continue forward with this retreat so necessary for the lives of our comfort, casual, technology-ridden men of today. So I appreciate all that. So your book and so much of everything that you state just really resonates and embodies what we're trying to do here at the Catholic Gentleman. So I couldn't be more grateful for this conversation. And I want to start by just talking about the general state of men in younger generations that you see today as kind of a common state of affairs, because that theme just keeps on coming back in your book. And I'd love to hear from you what you'd been recognizing and maybe what inspired you to write this.
Yeah, I think that if you take a look at young men today, they actually have, which is something I'm actually I'm in the middle of writing a book called The Psychology of Men and Women. And one of the things I talk about is in the 4th chapter, I talk about what's called the curse of Adam. And the curse of Adam is because he was irresponsible, now we're stuck as being irresponsible as men. And this is something that we have to work on in order to covet. And then the other thing is the fathers of the church say he was unwilling to be separated from the pleasures of his wife. And as a result of that, now he suffers from effeminacy, which is a unwillingness to put aside pleasure in order to pursue its arduous. So that's kind of the curse of Adam that kind of come together and coalesce. So what you see in young men today is the fact that their appetites for pleasure are fed. They get to sit around doing nothing. As you said, their life is very comfortable. They don't have to do any serious hard work. They actually just have to, most of their days spent in front of the television or the internet or playing video games or doing all sorts of stuff. And so what happens is precisely what you said in the beginning of the introduction is, men are very stunted today because they're as a result of that pleasure. In the book that I wrote and called Diabolic Influence, one of the things I mentioned in that book is the fact that psychologically, they always say that we get stunted at a specific age based upon trauma. And I started noticing a pattern, though, that same thing that you had observed where, guys are 35, but they still act like they're 14, right? And so I was kind of watching, I'm like, what is it that I'm actually seeing? And because I do a lot of work with people who are traumatized, what I began to realize, it's not just fear or pain or something that traumatizes people at a certain stage that actually causes them to become stunted at an age. It's whenever they give themselves entirely over to an emotion. And then in this particular case, it's to the emotion of delight or of desire in relationship to pleasure, and they kind of get stunted. So you can actually tell someone's age when they did that, when they kind of made that conscious decision that this is what I want to do, and at that stage. So I often give the example, there's a particular female politician that cackles a lot and everybody thinks she's just so immature. Well, what that tells us is something happened to her at the age of 16 where she gave herself over to something, and boom, she's at that age still.
Wow.
Right. So it's one of those things that, so that's what I was kind of noticing among the men. So it's kind of giving in that effeminacy, but then there's no responsibility. As I mentioned in the book, I mean, that's one of the things I learned over and over again. My father I would come down to the shop and he would say, I'd ask him, what do you want done? And he would just put me in charge of stuff. And then if I did it and it wasn't done right, he'd say, okay, go back and fix it. So there was that constant requirement to take charge of something, which is what responsibility does. And then, of course, the definition of responsibility is the ability to give an accounting of your actions. And so when I finished it, I was able to give an accounting of whether I did it poorly or badly or well. And so that's what I actually learned in that process. So having seen the fact that, the young men today have no responsibility and they're they're very effeminate, they're very soft emotionally, psychologically, physically, etc. And also it was such disparate, as you mentioned before, it was so different from how when we grew up. So then I thought to myself, you know what? My father had just passed. I thought, while this stuff is still fresh in my mind, I'm going to just write it out. There was a lot of stuff I didn't put in there, but it was even though I talk about there's a lot of hard work and stuff like that and the moral lessons that are learned, it was a great joy for me to actually work around my father and to actually do mechanical work, because there's great satisfaction as a man when you actually are able to complete a project and accomplish something that's difficult. And so that reward was there all the time, which kind of really spurred me on. So I thought, I'm going to write this book, and then both as an honor to my father, but then also to see, what people's kind of response was to it.
Yeah, I'm really appreciative that you decided to do that, because I've read and for our listeners, I've read some of his other books, and you need a certain academic prowess and that you maintain, Father, and it's very edifying. But it also, you sit down with an intention, with an notepad on the other side, and you're working through it. But with this one, it's just an incredibly enjoyable read, and it's something that you can easily connect to your narrative, and then you do such a great job of pulling out all these virtues and natural law principles and first principle thinkings and all of these things in a way that's really easy to maintain and grasp. So your father gave you agency, which is something that I see solely lacking in children. I have 6 kids, and I'm struggling with this with my own kids. It's like, what can I do to give them agency? We unplug the TV for at minimum 5 days a week. We're getting them outside. We're requiring them of chores, but we've inherited this sort of worldview, or this sort of maybe way of operating with technology and all that makes it incredibly difficult and something that we have to work against. But I love the fact that you brought emotions into it right away, because that was actually my first line of thought I wanted to bring up. Is you have this great section, it could be an entire episode in and of itself, is the primacy of reality.
Yes.
You bring that up, you touch on so many different things that I hope to cover in today's episode. And one of them is the fact that your emotions are leading people today. Another one is that reality doesn't care what you think. And when you said that, I immediately, kind of did a fist bump and was like, yes, I mean, this is what we see in gender dysphoria. This is what we see in just general entitlement across the board, right? And so I'd love for you to take some time and share with us your thoughts on this primacy of reality. And maybe we lead with emotions first and how emotions are just kind of controlling the lives of men, furthering on what you already talked about earlier.
Yeah, well, St. Thomas has this fantastic point where he talks about how he talks about it in context of fear, but it's actually true about all the emotions, about how it causes contraction. And contraction is the result of when you have a strong emotion, what it does, it draws your focus interiorly. So you're really looking at yourself and your experience rather than the actual reality of the situation, because it literally disconnects you from reality. And so in this particular chapter in that book, I talk about the fact that, I wanted something to be fixed. I thought it was fixed, but it wasn't fixed. So what I wanted and what I thought had no bearing at all on the reality of what the state of this thing actually was. And so, and that's when even though I used that episode primarily to work on that, it was my dad and I would talk from time to time, and just all throughout the, because you're working around each other all the time.
Yeah.
But it was the whole formation I got. My dad was very commonsensical, which is because he was so grounded in reality. And that episode shows that, in the end, the only way you're ever going to really achieve something, and I even talk about it, you actually have less suffering if you just conform yourself to reality first, and then things become a lot easier. It's when you perpetuate yourself in these emotions independent of reality that it actually becomes a problem. And, you mentioned the gender dysphoria. So it's our whole culture has become that way. And you even see it among a lot of the men today, where they're just completely disconnected from reality because they're so emotional. And that's one of the things I liked about this particular thing. The other thing is I mentioned in there that the fact that my dad was a master of one-liners, which kind of comes out in
idioms
the book.
And yes, absolutely, it sure does.
And he just said to me, he just looks at me and says, "Knock it off," because I was angry that the thing wasn't fixed. He just says, "Knock it off and fix it," right? And just his tone and the way and then he just walks off and he goes back into the shop. And my dad had a phenomenal ability to read the children very well, and so he could tell, he got the point across. He's going back to work. He's got better things to do than to sit and deal with it. And of course, as the way we were brought up, that meant that if my father said something like that, that meant, okay, it's time to focus on what he said, pay attention to it, and do what he said. And then, and as I kind of mentioned it at one point in the book, usually if I did what he said, it turned out better anyway. So.
Yeah, so true. Well, and what you're saying resonates with me, and I'll admit that I wish I had learned that lesson in a stronger way earlier in life. I was replacing lower control arms on our minivan, our family minivan, a few years ago, and what I thought was going to take 3 hours, and admittedly, I've replaced transmissions, replaced, some starters and I changed the brakes and changed the oil and all that stuff. But one of the things that in my ignorance I didn't realize was that both sides of the car aren't identical. So it took me like 2.5 hours to change one lower control arm. Then I went to the other side and I had to actually raise the engine block, and it was a totally different ballgame to get to that lower control arm. And the anger that enraged within me, the fact that it took me like 8 hours to replace the next side was just, again, but to your point, the minivan didn't care what I thought about it. And then having the right tools for the jobs, I want to talk about that later. I just jumped to it. I didn't use a torque wrench to put back on a couple of, this was really dangerous. And I'm so grateful that I felt a buzz shortly after driving it. When I was driving it, and it was like this shifting, and I got under there and one of the bolts was already starting to loosen. And when I would hit a certain mileage, it would vibrate. And so I These little things were connecting with me. Let's talk more about that reality doesn't care what you think, because we
Right.
have lost that truth so deeply in our society today.
Yeah, well, as a mechanic, that's what you learn over and over again because, even in the diagnosis, because I mentioned this, when you're trying to diagnose what a problem is in relationship to something, your idea of what it could possibly be wrong with it, you don't even know if that's true until you actually dig into the thing and you're actually in it and you find what the actual problem is. Sometimes it lines out, sometimes it doesn't. Obviously, if you're a mechanic and you've done stuff over and over again, majority of the time you're going to be on the ball, or on track
Yeah.
or be accurate. But there's numerous times that you get into it, and there was actually one story where I talk about this. This guy had this short block, and usually the valve seats would come out of the short block when it would behave a specific way, and it was behaving exactly like that. And we told the guy, well, okay, well, this is we got to dig in this, we got to order the short block, and if we find it's not it, you're still stuck with a short block. Is basically what we told the guy. And so when we got in, of course, I found that wasn't actually what the problem was. It was something much more minor. But this is an indicator over and over again as a mechanic that you start to learn that a lot of times what you think doesn't congruent with reality. On the other hand, what it also does is, and this is what it really helped me to do, is to realize that I have to improve my ability to grasp reality. And that's going to come by being as objective as possible and try and learn from my mistakes and learn from things as you go along. And so it's really that process of trying to conform yourself as much as you can to reality that actually gives you a better grasp of it. And so I think that's, and again, it doesn't matter how you feel about a thing or even what you think. And this is, I think this is one of the biggest problems that you actually see in our culture today, particularly even among some of the men, is this idea that, well, if I think it is the case, then it's the case. No, that's not how this works.
Yeah.
And you're seeing it over and over again. Or there's also kind of this attitude, which is actually something which you kind of just mentioned in the mechanical part. With the mechanics, the thing has a structure, which means if you're going to put it back together right, you have to put it back based upon the nature of that structure. You can't force it. You can't try and impose your idea on what you think it should be. You can't modify it, because otherwise when you get done, it's just not going to work. And that's true in relationship to reality in general. And you see today people's attitude is if they just lie or force or do certain things enough, eventually reality will change to accommodate them. And that's just not how this works. And that, as I think, as a mechanic, and it's not just as a mechanic, I think that would be true about anybody who's doing any kind of work with their hands, whether it's a trade like plumbing or electrical, or just even fix woodworking, that type of thing. You begin to realize that materials have a specific nature. They can only be handled a certain way, which is what reality is. And then if you're going to get this thing to come out right, it has to go together in the proper sequence and stuff. And so it's all about getting your mind to conform to reality. Ultimately, in the end, is where truth lies, of course, because truth is when there's that congruity between intellect and thing. That is an adherence or adequation. St. Thomas defines it as intellect with thing. And so that's actually how you find out the truth, ultimately.
Yeah, excellent. And there was a line, I don't know if it was your grandfather or your father brought it up, where he would go through and you guys would put bolts and things like that and extra parts in there. And I remember him saying that you're such a good mechanic, you can put it back together with less parts than it came out with, right? Like, right, yeah. So there's some bolts here, and that's exactly what we're talking about. This bolt isn't needed, but that's not the case, right? That's not the reality. And you can have some humor in that. So I enjoyed that.
And one of the things too is that even when you think you've done it right,
yes.
So you'll put the whole thing back together, and then you look over in the pan, and there's this bolt, that's all the way inside the motor, right?
Exactly.
You're like, I can't believe I forgot that thing. But okay, it doesn't matter how I feel. I still got to re-tear the thing back down and do it right, because otherwise it's not going to work.
That's right. And I wasn't planning on going into this, but I've replaced a bunch of my dryer things. And as you talked about, I think in one of the stories, there was a gentleman that needed his whole dash removed, and he ended up, what was it, on stupidity or something like that, or cheapness. That's what it was, on being cheap, right? On individuals. Because when they put it together, they weren't thinking about convenience on your part. They were thinking about efficiency and getting it together. So if we miss things, we might have to undo the whole thing again. Isn't that a lesson for life?
Yeah, it is, exactly. And that's not only true just about mechanics, it's actually true about, as you mentioned, a whole variety of things in our life. If you get it wrong in the beginning, well, then you're going to have to stop and go back and address it and deal with it.
Yeah. And so I want to talk about these tools and everything that we're talking about, because I think there's some deep truth to that men don't realize. So I think part of being a man is this understanding that you can be competent and capable in the world, right? And,
Right.
I have found that men, they want to know that regardless of a situation, they can take care of themselves. And what you wrote, I found just so true in my own life and general use. There was a quote here. It said, I observed that not learning how to use a basic set of tools and do basic repairs is effeminizing on a man. And that was learned, from your experience. And I've learned that as well. And allow
Yeah.
me just to share here, I changed the oils in my car. And every single time I've done that, and wherever I live, guaranteed one or two guys are going to come over while I'm changing the oil in my car, be like, oh man, I don't even know how to do that. Like, how do you it's just changing the oil. I mean, but they don't actually even know where to find the oil,
Right.
let alone how to change it. And you can tell this effeminizing idea that you brought up here really resonated with me because I've experienced that in every single place that I've lived in. And it's just changing the oil. It's not a transmission. It's not, removing the engine, et cetera. But so I'd love for you to share a little bit more on men and our need to learn tools and be able to utilize them rightly.
Yeah, but when I mentioned that it has an effeminizing effect on them is because part of being a man is kind of what you said, but you're actually capable of doing. You have a certain capability, and and it doesn't mean that you have to be an expert mechanic or an expert electrician or something. It just means that you should have a generalized knowledge of how to do basic things around the home, basic things in life, etc., just to be a normal man. Because then otherwise, it's almost like being a child. Someone else has to take care of it for you. So you don't really feel like there's a true masculinity when someone else has to step in and take care of something.
That's
when
right.
you should have been able to do it, right? And I mean, like I said, it's one thing if it's something very complicated, like I can do drywall, but it doesn't turn out pretty, right? So that's one of those things I'll have somebody do. But on the other hand, I've framed, I've done electrical, I've done all that stuff. So it's that type of thing. But it is true in the sense that if you don't get to the point where you can understand how to even use a basic set of tools, there's an incapacity or an inability to do it. One of the things that we started noticing as psychologists, it was actually after a particular friend of mine pointed it out. He said, I think a lot of the reason people have so much anxiety is because they can't do anything. And so I think this is one of the reasons why you see a lot of guys suffering from anxiety today, whereas a guy that's capable of doing most things or a lot of things, stuff doesn't bother him as much. He doesn't worry about it because he figures, well, when something comes up, I'll figure out how to do it or what have you. But, stuff just doesn't bother him. But the other thing I started noticing too was, and this was a particular difficulty that I would run across with people all the time, is if they hadn't used a set of tools and learned how to use basic tools, doesn't mean you have to learn all the tools. It just means you have to lose just some basics in relationship to using tools. By the time they're about 20, 25, we actually know this by modern brain studies. There's a kind of a plasticity begins to wane during that time frame, and so the brain doesn't have as much of an ability to learn and to adapt or to learn these things. And so you'll see the guys that are like over 25 and they're just now starting to learn a set of tools. I mean, it's kind of. I don't laugh at them, but sometimes they don't even know how to hold a screwdriver. It's literally on that level. Or even if they do get to the point where they can kind of do some basics things, they never become really proficient at it. And that's just one of the reasons why I tell, guys that are raising boys, you really need to teach your boys the basics about just basic home repair stuff around the home, how to do the basic stuff like change the oil, stuff like that, so that they actually learn this stuff so that when they do get into a situation, then they do have the capacity to learn it or at least be able to do what they can do so that they're actually a real man and not, having to be taken care of like a little boy, as I mentioned.
Exactly. There's just such confidence that's built within this. I want to just talk about this. I feel so blessed that my father did this for me because right now, especially with YouTube, right? If we want to talk about a benefit of YouTube, this episode's going to be there. There's a benefit. But another benefit of YouTube is that we can watch mechanics do these sort of things. But the point is though, if you don't have that confidence, you're not going to even attempt that. And so I don't want to overstate it, but parts of my house could be falling, and I feel like I could figure out how to fix it because I know how to use tools. I know how to put those things together. And we just have that lack of confidence. And so we start, I'd say, finding our identity in other areas of life, right? Like I'm good at reading books. I'm good at doing this. And so, and I think it just lacks that wholeness of what it means to be a man. And I think that's really what you're getting at here with that ability to utilize those tools rightly and in right order, and then know how to handle them.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And part of it has to do with because God gave Adam the task of working, right? He says, well, now you have to work in pain and thorns, etc. So he sets it out. So the work is going to be painful, which is actually the antidote. The first time I actually came across it, it's the antidote to this lack of maturity that you see among men. It was Fulton Sheen who said it, and then I started noticing that this is actually the punishment that God gave to Adam. So Fulton Sheen says, well, we mature by pain, by suffering, basically, and by responsibility. Well, that's exactly what Adam did. Well, now you're going to have to work, which is a responsibility in relationship. You have to take responsibility to provide for Eve, and then it's going to be painful. So he provides the antidotes for these things. Well, what I started noticing is that the guys that don't do any kind of really hard work or do those other things rather than and also from time to time engage in things that require the use of hands, there's not it kind of has an effeminizing effect because the guy just never really learns how to do those things. But then also I started noticing this too, and this is something which, because it was my own experience, and so I'm looking at why is it that guys, for example, when in fact, I even mentioned it, the best kind of a job is when you get to buy a new tool, right?
Amen. Absolutely.
Why is that the case? And I think it's because real men, because the tool helps us to accomplish things, which God not only gave us the punishment for having to work, but he also gave us the natural inclination to find fulfillment in that work, that the tools help us to achieve that. And so that's why we find tools. I think that's one of the reasons why boys find technology so alluring, because it's basically a tool, but it's unmoderated in relationship to the pleasure that they get out of it. But the point is that a tool helps us to accomplish something. And as a result of that, men just love tools, right?
Yes.
And so you actually see that. I tell people, you can just never have too many tools, that kind of thing. Great. Or as like I mentioned to my brother-in-law one time, he's trying to fix something. He couldn't get it fixed. So he asked me to come over and take a look at it. And so I went back in my truck, got the tool, came out and fixed it right away. And I said, it's all about the tools,
That's right. It's so true. I love that. And you're spot on that the best projects are the ones that you get to buy a new tool. I've been wanting a wood planer for a long time, but I don't have a project yet that quite requires it, financially speaking. But I'm looking forward to that opportunity because it's so true. And a tool that you can come back to, and then it opens up possibilities. I love that. It's so true. I've experienced it myself.
Yeah, and it's one of those things where I would actually, part of it is too, one of the reasons I would also, in fact, my dad, one of the things, when my dad closed his shop, it was so painful because we wanted to take all his tools, but he just didn't have the money at the time, and we didn't have the any place to store them. But if I was there, if I was here where I was, if I was there where I am now here, I would have just taken every single tool he had, because he had just some of the specialty tools and stuff that you can't do things without them, and I would have taken them, but it helps me to realize, like right now, and I told my dad numerous times, which I mentioned in the book, that it saved me thousands of dollars. I mean, tens of thousands of dollars being able to do stuff because of what he had actually trained me. But also I realized, it's actually cheaper for me to buy the new tool, do the work myself, than take it into some guy to have it fixed. So I'm just going to do it myself.
Agreed. I think that's excellent. And I can actually think I have a hammer that was my grandfather's. I have a buck knife that was my grandfather's. Yeah. It's like an heirloom. And my kids have asked me this because I have like 3 hammers, like regular hammers. And then I've got a bunch of other ones. And they're like, why do you have so many hammers? And I was like, well, and I hope to get to this, but one of them was like passed down to me from my grandfather. And so there's just that tradition, that went down in there. Now talking about 3 hammers, because what if we don't put them back where they belong? There's a place for everything and everything in its place. I'd love for you to share a little bit about that, especially within a mechanic's shop and the importance of that. I know you brought that up and it resonated with me.
Yeah, it revolves around a particular story that involved a pack rat. Ultimately, a pack rat was toting our tools off, and we didn't know it until much later. And
I didn't
those
realize,
tools were just disappearing. And what happens is the reason you always put the tool back. There's two things you do with the tool when you're finished. You put it back exactly where you got it, and that's because everyone else working around you and you yourself, when you go to look for the thing, you're going to go back to where it normally is. And so if you don't do that, then you end up wasting time trying to hunt for the tool and stuff of that sort. But then you also put it in a condition so that the next guy can use it immediately rather than having to clean it up or what have you. And so that's actually one of the reasons why when the pack rat started toting off our tools, we're like trying to find stuff, and it kind of slowed us down a little bit there because some of the stuff we would use regularly, he was toting off. But eventually we caught the pack. My dad caught the pack rat, and then he killed it. And then it was a few weeks later, he found all the tools. So it was because he was in a specific place. But
Wow.
but yeah, and this is something. And part of this also I didn't mention it in the context of the book, but it's also about basically being responsible, right? It's irresponsible just when you're done with the tools or you don't clean up after yourself or stuff. That's just irresponsible. Whereas if you put it back right where you got it, that's actually how you help children to build that responsibility.
Yeah, our God is a God of order. And if we are so disordered, not only does it visually affect everybody in your family, but your ability to actually get at a project, right? How many of us need to do something and it's months and months before we get around to it simply because we don't have the right order in our lives and the right order in our workshop, if you will. So it goes a long ways and stems throughout all. So
yeah, it's actually one of the reasons why when I in a shop, if it's disorderly or if you don't have the tools in a orderly place, it just frustrates me because you're just spending a lot of time looking for stuff you don't have to.
yeah, exactly. What a waste of time. And that costs you money, cost us sanity.
Yeah, as a mechanic, time is money. And so you're just losing time, and which means you're losing money.
Yeah. So I wanted to jump over. I want to talk about leisure a little bit here, because when you were talking, like woodworking for me is a leisurely activity, but I realized that I don't get to involve myself in that leisure frequently enough because I don't always put things back, right? And I think that when everything is in its place, we can then readily take advantage of that recreative time there in leisure. You talk about leisure in your book with your dad and fishing. How important is it for the lives of men to experience leisure rightly? And I'd love for you to share some of those stories that you had with your father.
Yeah, because what we would do is every so often he would just close up the shop and we'd actually go fishing. And it taught me, and we always looked forward to it. And part of it was something that I learned later from Aristotle, reading a book on Aristotle where he says that we do recreation in order to be recreated so that we can actually go back to work. And so there's that recognition that you can't be a workaholic. You can't work 24/7 every 365, because in the end you become less efficient and things like that. So it's actually a really healthy and a good thing. But it also helped to solidify a very strong relationship with my father, being able to not just work with him, which is kind of the foundation, but actually being able to go and fish and do those things with him. And so being able to just kind of shut things down, it was almost for the number of years, especially when I was in high school and early college, it would be the 4th of July. We'd close the week of the 4th of July and actually go to Pinedale, Wyoming and fish and that type of thing. And so that was one of the reasons that we would actually do it. But it's also a necessary thing. So my dad taught me, I think, a good balance in that regard. Yeah, you work hard, but then also it's time to get down. There's time to just relax and get some downtime.
Yeah, and I think men get it wrong though today, right? And so when we're looking at today, going fishing is so edifying. It's tangible, it's incarnational. We're actually able to experience something. I think Netflix and binge watching and I think technology and social media have, very little to do with leisure, but rather a distraction from work. I'd love to hear your thoughts on kind of what's happening today, where people turn to these forms of entertainment that are not actually recreating them. Again, they're just distracting them from work. They're mindless for the sake of getting back to work or ignoring work for a period of time. And that's not what we're talking about here, and not in what men need in their lives.
Yeah, you need something. Yeah, you need something that's actually wholesome and tangible. Like you said, it's tangible. It has to be. I think, especially as men, when you're raising boys, it can't be something where you're just sitting around and you're not actually doing something in the process. Whereas with fishing, especially because it was fly fishing, it was actually, it's a very active form of fishing, and you're doing certain things all the time. But the form of recreations that we would all very often do. And especially even when I don't mention this in the book, but, my parents would every so often, they'd just pack up all his kids and we'd get my dad's van or my dad's truck or the car, and we would just drive somewhere and go look at a museum or look at stuff. So there was actually ways in which it was, I think the difference is primarily in this, and this is something I've noticed. It's one of the reasons why I just don't watch a whole lot of videos. If I watch videos, it's, sometimes I'll watch a little bit, but what I noticed is that if I watch a lot of videos, it doesn't recreate me in the same way, as opposed to something that even if it requires a little bit of physical exertion, that I'm actually enjoying, and I just don't get the same kind of recreation from it that I do, and this is one of the reasons why it's the same thing with the computer and things of that sort. In fact, one time, this was much later in life, my dad noticed, because I was the superior of our community and I had just had a lot of correspondence and stuff I had to maintain. He just looks at me and says, "What are you going to do when you retire?" And I said, "The computer and the phone are going in the trash. If people want to talk to me, they can come talk to me." It's that kind of thing. But it does, and this is something I actually talk about in there too, about the limits of, computers and stuff like that. And we're getting them involved in areas that I don't think are really beneficial. But that being said, I think the types of recreation people do today, it really gives us, it causes more like a spiritual and a psychological dissipation rather than a true recreation.
I couldn't agree more. And so how would you encourage men who have lived this lifestyle, or maybe men that this is resonating with, to get involved in some sort of leisurely activity, when normally they are just endlessly scrolling or binge watching TV, and a vacation becomes that? I've seen that way too many times, that people go on vacation to a beautiful location and they end up just watching movies every night. And it's like, what are you doing? What are you doing? I'd love to hear your thoughts on getting men up and out.
For me, vacation means getting away from all of that, actually.
Amen.
In fact, I hardly ever watch TV anyway. The only time I watch a little bit of TV is when I visit my mother. Other than that, I just don't even bother watching TV. Part of it is because for me, I just consider it a colossal waste of time. And I actually don't enjoy what's on there most of the time anyway, or I don't enjoy it enough. But I just tell people, look, you just got to put that stuff down, get away from that stuff, and go out and do something that actually is going to improve something like a skill. Like fly fishing is an actual art form.
It is.
And there's, or doing other things like even if it's just like bike riding or camping or doing those things, it gets you out. And so you actually learn basic skills. You're putting things in place, and you're actually doing things bodily, because you actually need to do stuff bodily also to be recreated as well. And so, obviously working hard in a mechanic shop and fly fishing are very different kinds of activities. But they're both physical, but fly fishing, generally speaking, doesn't require as much energy generally. But anyway, it's just a different activity, but I think some of it has to do with too, is, we talked about in the beginning of the segment, how I feel and how I think doesn't have any connection to reality. The problem with watching TV and all that stuff, it continues that disconnect from reality. Whereas going out fishing or biking or camping or things like that, or doing stuff, doing stuff together, just other kinds of hobbies, that type of thing, it puts you back into contact with reality. And that's one of the reasons why I mentioned it in the book. Even to this day, I still do mechanical work from time to time just to reground me back in reality.
Yeah, I love it. And I took a couple of my sons camping a couple months ago, and my 6-year-old, it was the first time he'd ever been camping. And he came back. It was just shortly after prayer time in the morning. My wife and I are there, and he came down, And he talked about being a man. And my wife was like, well, not yet. You're 6. But your father is dedicated in making you a man. And he looked at her and he goes, I went camping. I'm a man. And there really is, there's that essence like within the heart of men, right? Like these sort of things, it's like a rite of passage for him, and I didn't expect that at all. And we just went fishing and swimming and hiking and stuff like that. It wasn't, it was what a 6-year-old could do. But for him, it was a transformative experience. So.
Yeah, for us, the rite of passage was elk hunting for the boys.
Elk hunting. Oh, I can't imagine.
The first time I went elk hunting, that was the rite of passage.
That's right. Tell me about that. Did you hit an elk dressing an elk? So I've only heard dressing an elk and shifting, getting an elk from one place to the next is a exhausting experience.
So in high school, every single year I went, we didn't see anything. Every year I didn't go, they got something. So,
I believe it.
But actually, after I still enjoyed it. We deer hunt at the same time too, but we did all sorts of other kind of hunting as well. But then, it was about 4 years ago, I actually shot. It was basically a trophy elk. This thing was gargantuan, and so I was, it's something that sticks with you. But just even if you don't get the elk, right?
Agreed.
And going. But it was also during that time frame that we went antelope hunting. So you learned how to dress an animal, dress them out, and actually, we even processed our own meat and everything. So this last elk I shot, I actually did my own processing of my own meat. Part of it was because I wanted a lot of hamburger because it was very convenient. But anyway, the thing is that it teaches you skills, but it also gives you a sense of, I kind of mentioned in the book with the pack rat. My dad says, throw it down on the ground and crush its head. And there was this pause, which I had been hunting and killing things all my life. And then there's this pause. And I admit, I didn't put it in the book, but I think, but the thing's so cute. I hate to do it to it,
Yeah.
But my dad's like, you got to kill the thing. So, but anyway, it was, he didn't even discuss it. He just throw it down and then he did it. So, but it gives you that refocus. But I think that hunting is, and fishing is one of those things that it helps you get also a proper sense of the order of nature that men should really have, that these things are there for us. We should, take use of them. We kill them for our benefit, etc. But then there's also, it gave you a deep appreciation, which is something my father did too. He gave us a deep appreciation of those things of nature that God had created. So again, it was another one of those things that puts you in contact with reality.
I want to take a moment and thank today's sponsor. Men, have you checked out Exodus 90 lately? If you've heard of Exodus 90, you're probably thinking Lent and cold showers, but the Exodus 90 app offers so much more. It's a daily companion to help you grow closer to God and to become the man He wants you to be. Download the Exodus 90 app now so you can grow in your devotion to the Sacred Heart of Jesus during the month of June, which is the month of the Sacred Heart. I've been following along with the app's daily scriptures, reflections, and prayers dedicated to the Sacred Heart of Jesus, and it's awesome. On the app, you'll learn more about the new Exodus 90 Summer Book Club. And I want to invite you to join the new Exodus 90 Summer Book Club to read Chastity, Reconciliation of the Senses by Bishop Eric Varden, which is a great book. We often view chastity as a prohibition, something that drains life out of us. But Bishop Varden shows us just how genuinely human and life-giving Christian chastity should be, leading to the healing and true love. It's a refreshing and beautiful take on this most important virtue. Go to exodus90.com/CatholicGentleman for a free 14-day trial to the Exodus 90 app and to learn more about the Exodus 90 Summer Book Club. Again, check out exodus90.com/CatholicGentleman or click on that link in the show notes and join us for a great summer read. God bless. Oh, I think that's so good. And there's something you touched on there that there's that saying, right? A bad day hunting is still a great day. And there's a certain pointlessness to it. That's the only word that's coming to mind. It's probably not the right word, but when we're doing these things, it's not about the end, because we live in this world that, we identify ourselves with the end and our accomplishments and the things of this world, instead of as being a son of God. And so there's this certain, with leisure, with doing these things, and I'm glad that you brought that up, because I've been hunting with my father as well, where we didn't see a single animal that we were, looking for. And it was still a great day. It was a great time to be there, right? There's that certain pointlessness to it that is edifying just the same.
Yeah, and what it does is it points out the reality of you kind of touched on it there just for a minute, which is the fact that it's not necessarily so much in what we accomplish, it's in the virtue formation and in the formation of ourselves in the process of doing it. That's the key thing. It's what's being accomplished interiorly in us, not necessarily exteriorly.
Oh, excellent. So I'd love to talk a little bit about sacrifice. You do an excellent job in the book. You talk about like long sacrifices often, take a long time, over time, not just something that's instant, and how this can help form a man rightly. Now, we can go down the theological importance of sacrifice and Christ's ultimate sacrifice and us, being another Christ to this world. But I'd like to just hear from you the sacrifices that you learned in the shop.
Yeah, I think there was two parts to it. The first is, because it's hard work, and sometimes you smack your knuckles and things like that. So there's a kind of a sacrifice in the sense of that you have to kind of put away your bodily comfort and things like that. You have to sacrifice those things, or even, you being exhausted is also just a sacrifice. So doing the grind day after day after day, or just even on one day for a long period of time. And even sometimes there's some types of jobs that are just tiring because you have to spend all sorts of time working at them and keeping, and it's a grind in the sense that you have to be consistent, because if you kind of stop, you're just never going to get the job done. So there was that, but then, so that's one of the things I learned being around my father. But the other thing is just watching him, do that, what I just mentioned, year after year after year, and to support his family. And there was that willingness to sacrifice and to do all those things which were necessary for us ultimately, because he didn't. And this is something I really learned towards the end. I mean, I loved working at the shop, so it was one of those things that I kind of presumed that so did he, and I think he did. I think he did have it. But at a certain point, when he got older, it was, as I mentioned, there's a chapter just called "Moving On." Right? It was time for him. He just wanted to move on from it, but because he had done it for so long and had sacrificed so long. But it also made me realize that a true man doesn't look at the pain or the suffering or the grind. He looks at, okay, this is what I got to get done. This is what I'm going to do. And there is, I talk about this, I'm going to be working at it into the book. And men have a specific ability to, it's called inattentional blindness. It's something which is distinct from women. Women do have it, but not on the kind of a level that we do. That's the ability to focus on something and tune everything else out. Right?
Yes.
And it's this is why it frustrates women, because the guy's watching TV and he comes and talks. He doesn't hear anything she says, right?
Yeah.
But it's a necessary thing to go to war, but it's also a necessary thing to work. You have to be able to tune everything else out, even your own suffering or even emotion, how you feel, in order to focus on getting the thing done. And so this is what it taught me: is a real man is able to do that. He's able to just put everything else aside and grind day after day after day in order to sacrifice, in order to achieve a greater good. Because ultimately, most men don't sacrifice because they have this fear of missing out of this thing that they're going to have to sacrifice. Whereas a true man is willing to put that lower or lesser good aside in order to achieve this greater good. And that's actually something that I just observed that my dad was willing to sacrifice. And it's not just in the hard work, but it's also, over the course of years, it started to take a physical toll on him and things like that. And that's something that men also do. True men are willing to do that slow sacrifice of, it's going to affect my health long term. My knees are going to go bad, or I'm going to have this issue or that issue. But I have to do this in order to provide for the family. And there's that sense that he gave me that deep sense of sacrificing long term.
Excellent. And we're touching on something here, which is really the father's impact on the lives of his children. I was very blessed, admittedly, to have a father that likewise was gone oftentimes at 5:30 a.m. to go work. He worked a desk job with a railroad. Actually, he worked on the railroad for quite a while, and then he worked at a desk job for the railroad. But it was such an opportunity for me, an educational opportunity, if you will. And while he lacked, certain book smarts, if you will, what he knew in common sense and what he knew in these things and the example that he gave me, he didn't complain. He woke up every morning. He came back at 5. He was gone for 11 to 12 hours a day. That consistent grind without complaining affected me. And every single time, not every single time, I wish it was every single time, that was an overstatement, but very frequently when I'm complaining, I'm immediately chastising myself, A, because it's not virtuous, but B, because it's not an example that my father ever gave me. I'd love for you to talk a little bit about the impact that fathers have on their children, because obviously that's the theme, of this book.
Yeah, and it's actually there's even a chapter in there where I was complaining because I'd been working as a priest. I even came back and helped him out as a priest, and I was kind of complaining about it. And he just looks at me, "What do you think I've been doing all my life?" And immediately it hit me because my dad, I don't ever recall him ever complaining about the hard work at the shop ever.
Incredible.
And the long hours and stuff like that. We would talk about it, but it was never a kind of a complaining thing. It was just kind of an acknowledgement of it. But I think that that it basically really gets down to something which probably is exactly something that you would probably say is true in your own life, as you mentioned, in relationship to your father. In my book in psychology, there's a chapter called implicit learning. And basically what it is, it's a form of learning where you're not sitting down and you're formally studying a subject, like in school or something. It's rather what you learn by association, just by observing people's behavior, right? And so we learn a tremendous amount of stuff on how we're supposed to behave by the way our parents behave. And so one of the things I learned in relationship to my father was that very thing, that he just day after day after day, he just never complained, and he just worked hard. He just didn't, and when he was done, then, once in a while he would kind of take a little bit of time to kind of recoup physically, but then he would go back to working. And so watching him was itself how I learned so much about, everything from how to be a mechanic, because I would watch him when he would repair stuff so that I would quickly learn that. But then, but also just the virtues that he would demonstrate in these things, the common sense, which you mentioned before, just the basic common sense that he had. This guy, his level of common sense was so phenomenal. I think that's why he was a master of one-liners. In fact, it was really funny because one time, we had a relative who something happened and the relative started panicking. And so later my dad, just observing it, he just says, "Look, when something happens, you don't panic, you think," right? And he was just so flatlined about it. So sometimes they'll tell you things like that, but a lot of times it's just watching how those kinds of things, how you behave, and just basic learning how to be a man, really ultimately, is just by watching it. Just recently, my assistant who does our vetting for the people that come to us that are looking for help, he said, I think that one of the biggest differences, which I think that you'd be able to say to John, is, he said, the biggest difference that we had when we grew up, as opposed to a lot of the men now, is we had an example in our fathers. And that's how we learn it.
Yeah, I think it's so great. And so a lot of I couldn't agree more. And I thank God for that, that I was born into a family that had a father like that, as I'm sure you do as well. So a lot of fathers listening, though, didn't have that from their dad, or they don't work in a mechanic shop of any sort. How would you encourage them to instill this upon their sons and children in general?
Well, it's kind of the same thing that Fulton Sheen mentioned, but it's also it's basically suffering and responsibility. You really have to put your boys in charge of stuff, make them be responsible, put them in charge of stuff. And it needs to be something, especially for boys, it needs to be something that's very often physically difficult and requires a bit of a grind. And that they have to do it consistently. And then also being responsible means they have to answer for it. So if they don't do it right, you don't clean it up after them. You do that. But then I think a lot of it is just spending the time, especially if you're raising, especially teenage boys and that type of thing, and even younger. But it's just getting them out. And when you have to repair something, don't just. This is one of the things as a father that I learned, I learned from my father, and I think you could probably relate to, is sometimes you just want to get the job done, but you actually have to take the time to show your son, okay, this is how you do this.
Amen.
And sometimes sometimes you'll hand him the tool and you'll say, okay, because this is what my father did to me when I was learning mechanics. he would say, he would stand there and instruct me how to do it and make me actually do it, rather than, there were times when if it was complicated, he would do it so I would see it once. But normally, if it was something that he thought I was capable of doing, he would just hand me the tools and say, okay, this, and he would just tell me what to do. And that's how I'd learn. And so it's the same thing here. You just sometimes, like if your sink is leaking underneath and all it is a matter of tightening up the nuts on the pipes, well, then you hand him the monkey wrench, and you just say, okay, go under there. This is what you do. This is what the problem is, and this is how you do it. And then you have him do it. So it's a matter of getting the hands on, getting them to do those things.
I agree. It just happened less than 2 weeks ago where my son dropped some coins down our garbage disposal. And what a great opportunity for him to learn how to fix a garbage disposal with me. Yes, because and it was time consuming, right? Pulling it apart, finding how to get to those coins. And he's 8 years old, but it was a great opportunity. And to your point, though, it required an exponential amount of patience. It felt like it to me, but maybe just because I'm weak. But it felt like a ton of patience to not just do it myself, but to literally have him there and see it through. That this is something that he did, and it's something that I need him to learn how to fix. And whether he wanted to be there or not didn't matter. So
yes, exactly. The other side of it is the payout for the father is seeing the son's joy in the accomplishment of having done it.
Amen. I appreciate that. So, here for my final question, I know that a lot of our listeners are just appreciative of how grounded you are in life. Knowing that you're an exorcist, right? You have a peek behind the veil, so to speak. In reading your book, I just saw this connection of how practical you are. And I'd love to hear, how do you feel like this experience in the shop, this experience with learning from your father, then prepared you more effectively, let's say, for your life as an exorcist and as a priest?
Well, it goes back to our initial discussion about it doesn't matter how I feel or think, it's the reality of the situation. In philosophy, because one of my doctorates in philosophy, one of the things that you learn is the principle of evidence. That there's two parts to that. One is that the certitude that you have over something is directly proportionate to the evidence, and that's one of the things you learn in a shop. Okay, you might have the thing when it's running, it might behave a certain way, but the evidence, that's not enough evidence. You need to get into the machine before you're going to find out what is actually causing that. It's the same thing with the diabolic. You might see certain things, or you might have certain thoughts about what looks like it's this. It's not until you dig into it with a prayer and the demon actually manifests, and then you finally get his name, that you actually can understand the complexion of actually what's going on. So it helped me to be very guarded in my judgment and being measured in my judgment, and not wanting to go to extremes or et cetera in my judgment about how especially because one of the things that we come across, because we train exorcists too, is with other priests, a lot of times what they do is the suffering that they're viewing the person has, the priest is, he's a compassionate man. And so a lot of times we tell guys, look, you have to put your compassion at the door, because if you don't do that, it's going to affect your judgment, and you're going to end up making excessive judgments. You're going to go to extreme. And I think being a mechanic, working in and day out, it helped me to really moderate that ability to judgment. It also, part of this had to do with just emulating my father. My father he had a very measured judgment of things. Rarely did he kind of go to extreme in his judgments of stuff. It was just always, he was very, grounded, like you said, and just observing that. And it also has to do with just basic common sense. I think the other thing is in diagnosing mechanical things, over the course of time, you get a kind of a sense of, you watch for patterns. Okay, when this particular model of engine runs this particular way, and you've seen it 4 or 5 times and it behaves that same way, then you usually it'll start to pattern out, well, then this is what the problem is. When I became an exorcist, I actually started noticing too that I started watching for those in the diagnosis. I was approaching it the same way in the mechanics. I started watching for patterns. And then over the course of time, that helped me to develop an entire book on these are the patterns that demons actually demonstrate and to show. And then, of course, working around mechanics, it's all about logic, right? So
that's right.
Stuff is very logical. It has a distinctive structure. You learn that, you have to put A next, the sequence is part A, part B, part C. And if you get it out of sequence, you're not going to end up with this machine isn't going to be put together right. Well, it's the same thing in logic. And so I also was able to take those logic skills and looking at, when demons would say certain things, you would see the A and the B. So I was able to quickly draw the conclusion C. So to give you an example, one time this one
Yeah.
demon, it was the feast of St. Catherine of Siena, and he was just
Okay.
tore up because I asked St. Catherine of Siena to come down. And at a certain point, I just stopped and said, wait a minute. So this is one of these kind of conclusions that you do. And my dad was really good at helping diagnose. He was probably one of the best diagnosticians that I ever saw. But at a certain point, I just said, wait a minute, you weren't the guy that St. Catherine of Siena kicked out in that public square, were you? And then he just went bonkers, right? So it does, once in a while, it does kind of have a bit of a payout. But it was all those things that I learned by the formation of my father as working as a mechanic, ended up translating over into taking a very systematic and an objective view in what I do. Because a lot of times stuff happens and it can be very psychologically impactful, but I was able to be much more objective. And also, just like my dad said, when something happens, you don't panic, you think. So when something happens, you don't emotionally react, you focus on it, and then you're able to, so that you can actually get to the truth of the matter, which is ultimately one of the things I mentioned in the book too, is your goal is to get to the truth of the matter so that you can actually fix it. Well, it's the same thing in exorcism. So there's been a lot of stuff that I've learned from my father, just kind of that calmness, keeping your emotions in check, all those things has really translated. It's been very beneficial.
I bet if your emotions are controlling you, that doesn't make a good exorcist, right?
No, because the demons have access to those and they can just pull your chain all over the place.
Wow. Wow. What a blessing for me and for our listeners to talk through this. I want to encourage every single person listening to go pick up this book. It really is an incredibly enjoyable read. And it's, again, you need very little academic. You just need to know how to read. And you're going to enjoy and gain a lot from this book. So, Father, where can our listeners learn more about you and your traditional Catholic Society of the Most Sorrowful Mother, as well as pick up this book? All links I will put in the show notes.
So the Society of the Most Sorrowful Mother, you can go to Dolorans, it's DOLORANS.org. We have a website. We just completed raising the money for our new chapel.
Praise God.
And pray for our vocations. That would be very helpful. And then so we get more vocations. And then as far as the book, the color version is only available at our website, which is centradpress.com. You can get, it just came out, you can get a black and white version either from our press, or you can also get it on Amazon now. But it's only the black and white. So the color version, that's one thing I learned about this book, is printing a book in color is so much more expensive than black and white. And so people asked me to put out a black and white version. I can't remember if it was you, John, or someone else that if you thought of putting that one out. I said, I probably should, but if you want the color version, it's because it's a picture book too. There's pictures. It's
excellent.
So there's pictures in there that are in color. But if you want to if you don't want to spend that kind of money, because it is quite a bit more, it's you can buy the paperback version either from it's in black and white, either from Centrad Press or on Amazon.
Well, thank you, Father. Thanks for your vocation. Thanks for your witness, and thanks for joining us today. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you very much, John.
And as we end each of our episodes, be a man, be a saint.